Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Shannon's Shelf. I am Shannon, or as the Gaelic speakers would call me, Shawneen. Yeah, I actually took a Scottish Gaelic class for pretty much just a few weeks. I should not have signed up. My schedule was already way too busy, unfortunately. I would love to learn the language at some point, though, in my life. It's one of those areas I am more interested in. I do have a fair amount of Scottish ancestry, and I occasionally wear a kilt when I feel like it. But either way, trying not to appropriate your history, Scotland. Don't get offended at me, okay? Like don't be angry, please. Don't hurt me. Today I wanted to talk about a book briefly, and I guess some thoughts I'm having around it. I finished this book yesterday, and I was meeting weekly with a friend. I was doing this as a buddy read. I was reading weekly. I was meeting weekly with a friend to discuss the chapters we read. We would read about 2 chapters at a time, and we finally finished, and that was the makers of Scotland. So that is Picts, Romans, Gaels, and Vikings. And generally speaking, I would say this is a good book. This is by Tim Clarkson. I've read one other book by him that was Ethelfled. I read that earlier this year. I did not make a video on it. This channel's only been started, you know, relatively recently. Maybe I'll make a video on it. I enjoyed that book. In fact, I think I enjoyed that one more than this one, but this one was not bad. And I would say this is perhaps a good introduction to a more academic study of Scotland. I think he did better focus on all but the Vikings of those in the title, because with the Picts, Gaels, Romans, we kind of got like some domestic structures, more political, social structures, and I feel like he didn't really talk about that in the Vikings. Now that stuff is definitely known, and I think he knew it himself. It just felt kind of odd that that got left out. There were some editing errors. Some things, like I think some chapters could have been renamed or maybe reworked a little bit. It's definitely some hyphenization for some words that I think something got shifted. So words that were in the middle of a paragraph, like in the middle of a page, were hyphenated and they didn't need to be. So there were some silly things like that. But either way, I think it's still fine. He is a reputable source. I know that. And I wouldn't be surprised if I end up reading more books by Tim Clarkson at some point. I do have another book lined up with my friend. It is going to be Scottish history. It's not by Tim Clarkson, though. And hopefully we get to that before the end of the year. That one is more, I'm more interested in, just because it's kind of I know I'm related very distantly and to some degree to the character we're going to be reading about, the guy we're going to be reading about. So that will be interesting to me. But I guess just some of the things I was thinking about. First off, those four groups are probably the biggest players, but there are definitely other groups when it comes to the history of Scotland. In fact, this story kind of goes up to when Scotland is kind of being considered as a whole nation, not just these regional kingdoms and chiefdoms and what have you. And the Picts have always been kind of interesting. They're kind of feel like a little mysterious maybe because we don't have their language deciphered, and because they didn't, well, we don't, not decipher necessarily. They never wrote anything down. And we know that a lot of Picts spoke Gaelic. There was kind of the Gaelicization of Scotland and whatnot. But there were a lot of Pictish kings that even had dominion over lots of the Gaels. So kind of interesting. The Gaels are cool. I mean, we like the Gaels, I guess. Obviously, they came over from Ireland. Ireland's cool too. I have ties to that place as well. I mean, Gaelic. It's my understanding that Ulster, Northern Irish Gaelic, is pretty similar to Scottish Gaelic. Maybe even more similar than perhaps Munster Gaelic is or something. I'm not exactly sure about that. I'm not an expert. Not yet. But if someone is an expert, feel free to let us know, I guess, in the comments. And also, while we're at it, feel free to like and subscribe. I always say that at the very end of the video, but I'm saying it now, okay? So do me a favor. But the Romans are kind of cool too. I think that, at least personally, and my friend Sean felt this way, is that all of these groups are interesting and kind of cool, but Rome gets a lot of attention, I think, in the West because of its importance in the West historically. But Rome takes the back seat when it comes to these cultures that I'm more interested in, or I feel like I have ethnic ties to. I'm not a Roman, but I'm Gaelic, ethnically to some degree, right? Although I'm definitely just an American. But so it's like I don't care when the Romans are picking on the Dacians, but I care when they're picking on the Britons and the Gaels. Like, they need to stop that. And so that might be kind of silly, but I honestly kind of can't help but feel that way to some degree, although I don't let it overwhelm me. I think history can be pretty complicated. pretty overwhelming. Even when you look at family histories, there are so many players involved. There's so many things involved. Families are not homogenous. Perhaps the only way you can get a homogenous thing out of a family, well, really, when you break it down, is just when you get to the single person, of course. And people can be full of contradictions and, I don't know, very interesting, but, constantly developing, like, influx. And I think that's fine. I feel like that would describe me, and at least my understanding in many ways. But when you take it past family, it gets even more and more distorted, like especially national history. What is national history? What does that even mean, right? And now I think that there could be an argument made for what's better, being broken up more into these tribal territories or having more solidified dominion and union over a wider territory, including different ethnicities, not needing to be homogenous, but being able to get along and what have you. I think there are people that would argue uh, that people need to be homogenous. They will historically, whatever, be more likely to get along. And I don't think that's necessarily true, even if I think there could be arguments both ways, maybe. I guess it might be up to you what you think. But those national histories, like I said, are full of so many people. And who decides whose stories are getting told? Who decides what is part of the national history? There's usually a few key players. So lots of it comes down to the political sphere, which I think is generally fair. That leaves a lot wanting, I think, leaves a lot lacking. And I think in many ways, recent history, we've been better about trying to find those voices that have been previously ignored or suppressed, pushed to the side. And I think that's great. I have a general kind of distaste for academia. I don't trust a lot of academics. They're kind of self-serving. And sometimes their self-serving ends up being pretty good for people. Sometimes it's just ends up being just good for themselves or maybe just for their department. But it does a discredit and it's dishonest, I think, often as well. And I think that has something to do just with Western institutions in many ways. Either way, but that's not what we're talking about. Or maybe we are. I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about. You can just click off this video. I don't know what I'm talking about. If we're letting the academics aside on that, I think that gives us some sort of understanding. I think having an understanding of these national identities and these national boundaries today is not a bad thing to have understanding for. I think being consumed with nationalistic ideas and tendencies is not a good thing, but it is what it is in many ways. I think it's important to not hate Canadians just because they're from Canada. I mean, they didn't do anything against me. If anything, lots of times I feel like such distaste should be aimed at the governments who are actually, taking care of doing bad things, as is often the case, and not necessarily the people, although the people can do bad things too. It kind of gets muddied pretty quick. I think it's best not to hate people. But then again, you can't stop your neighbor from hating you, even if you don't hate your neighbor. Unfortunately, humans tend to be that way. We tend to not be very smart. But best we can do, I guess, is try to be smart ourselves and help our family be smart and stuff like that. So I guess what my thoughts are, and maybe my suggestion, and you can let me know your own thoughts as well, is that I think reading these academic works to get an idea on topics is fine. I think if you want to get a general academic understanding of Scotland, you can read this book. But I think what's even better is after you've done that, I mean, I guess you can continue down doing more academic, more specialized academic research. But what's even more interesting, personally, is when you go over personal histories, get to folklore and folk tales and mythology and people and material culture, not necessarily what their art institution says is good. Because whatever the art institutions in New York say is good, that leaves out 99.99% of the rest of the United States and artists who are actually creating crafts and stuff like that. And so it's not always the best tell, despite what the museum directors tell you and what the academics who echo them tell you and stuff like that. That would be my recommendation. I love folk tales and stuff like that. And what's even better, and this is something that I don't really have access to, but I think would be awesome and I would love to perhaps leave for my descendants, is personal histories, journaling, stuff like that. That would be phenomenal. I feel like it would provide that much better of a connection. People have a tendency to discredit lots of those things, especially things like folk tales and mythologies, because they're like, oh, it's farcical, it's ridiculous, and I think a lot less ridiculous in many ways than they think, and if that stuff is ridiculous, then lots of the academic tendencies I think are just as ridiculous, if not more ridiculous, and more against uh, a healthy nature. But either way, those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts if you don't mind. I'm gonna try to do more fiction. I just haven't finished what I'm reading. I've been doing a lot of nonfiction lately. I like reading nonfiction. Obviously, if you are acquainted with this channel, you probably understand that. But I like to mix it up. I like to read fiction and nonfiction. Usually ends up being fantasy when it's fiction. I'm just currently reading The Rhythm of War. If you know about it, it's really long, so it's taking me a while to finish that. But hopefully, I'll finish that and another fiction book that I'm reading as a buddy read as well. Hopefully those won't take too long and I'll get to that. But either way, I've been Shannon, and I appreciate you watching, especially if you made it this far. Feel free to like and subscribe again. Hope you have a good one, and I will see you guys next time. And maybe we'll talk more about Scotland, because it's not a bad place to talk about, it seems.